eyes. Richard Milner is a force of nature and one of the most creative people that I've ever met in my life. So I have in my hand his what's sort of like a CD. And it fizzles with creativity. Now, some of you may know or not know that the Wallace celebrations that we're having on Friday night and on Saturday of this week is the brainchild of Richard Milner. He's the guy, the visionary, who got the money from the Templeton Foundation that's bringing in these famous people who have things to say about Wallace. But that's only the beginning of what Richard Milner has. Now, I'm not going to tell everything you've done, Richard, because some of the people...
I wish you wouldn't. We'd be arrested if you did.
Well, right, and some of them are young and impressionable.
Yeah.
However, I bet you could go online and find out a lot about Richard Milner. So at any rate, from the point of view of the things that all of us say, there's something that Richard published in 2009, and I actually think everyone who's interested in evolutionary biology ought to buy it. It's a book called Evolution from A to Z, Darwin's World, and it's really a good book.
Darwin's Universe.
Darwin's Universe.
Yeah.
And it's the kind of book that, okay, you have a question. You know, who's what the hell do you have to do with it? You go and find out. And you can find out about all sorts of other things in that book. It really is a remarkable resource for any of you who want to have that at your fingertips. So one of the things that Richard did, and I have to mention this because when I began my career, before I studied at graduate school, I worked at Bronx Zoo. And my office was in the old Heads and Horns Museum where there were these records, Heads and Horns, but it also had other things in it, including magnificent artwork. And the artwork of Charles R. Knight is something that I actually know something about because for all of the years that I worked at the Bronx, Charles R. Knight was right in front of my desk. I was one lucky human being.
If I may say, Charles R. Knight gave us our image of dinosaurs, cavemen, mammoths. He did the great murals in the Field Museum in Chicago and in the American Museum of Natural History. And I did what I hope is the definitive collection of his artwork and the story of his life in a book called Charles R. Knight, The Artist Who Saw Through Time.
And it's really a beautiful book. And for those of you who do illustration, I know most of you who are doing any sort of paleontological study.
And it's on Amazon at a big discount.
So, he did work in anthropology as a pup. This was almost before I was born, not really. And he worked with Peter Marler.
Well, I didn't work with him. I was a student of his, among 200 others. Yeah, I started in this a while ago. I probably have neckties older than most of you in the class.
Okay, so he's also a co-author recently of a book called The Last Human. It's from Yale University Press, and it got an award for Best Science Book of the Year 2007. He's also published a long time ago, 1993, the Best Young Adult Biography, Charles Darwin, Evolution of the Naturalist. I mean, there are a lot of these kind of awards, and I don't want to write them all down. He's written he's done 8 original songs about Darwin and evolution, performed by 100-voice choir, and if we're lucky, we will get to have Richard sing and perhaps dance for us today.
Hey, that wasn't in the contract.
And among the really interesting things to know about Richard Milner is that he was a senior editor at Natural History magazine for an eon, and among the people whom he edited was Stephen Jay Gould, and he and Stephen Jay Gould were great buddies. And it's fabulous to sit down with Richard sometime and get him to tell you about Stephen Jay Gould when he was writing those. How many of you read This Beautiful Life? Some of you are too young.
Well, those essays of Steve's in the magazine were collected in about 10 or 11 different books.
Yes, that's true.
Yeah.
So The Panda's Son is one of those. So you can read those essays today if you wanted to.
Yeah.
Among the things, though, Richard, I met Stephen Jay Gould a couple of times in my life, and when he first got sick, I wrote him this panicked email that he had to get well because he taught me so much. So very self-centered reasons for telling him he had to get well.
We miss him not only because he was a valued colleague, but oddly enough, he was my boyhood buddy when we were growing up. We used to go to the museum together when we were 12 and 13 years old. And in the...
you probably like baseball, too.
Well, he dragged me to the Yankee Stadium a couple of times, but I was called Dino by the other kids for dinosaurs. We were the only two kids interested in dinosaurs. Can you imagine the only two kids in the school interested in dinosaurs at that time? We started it. So I was known as Dino, and he had a nickname which he absolutely hated. He was called Fossil Face.
That's wonderful. So, some of you might, have any of you looked at Richard up online? Richard has a fabulous website. No, it is. It's a pretty interesting website, and now I'm not going to steal any more of his thunder. He's going to talk to us today about how he was raised, and this has to do with... Thank you very much, Richard.
Thank you, Patty. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. Very nice to see you here. Very nice to get out of the parking garage, where I've been for the last 40 minutes. All right. Could we close this and put my script down here? Okay. All right. All right. Wallace, Darwin, and spiritualism, the trial of Henry Slade. What happened? I made. All right.
Here, I'll get more serious.
Okay. I'll just hold the book like this and use the clicker. Okay.
Well, I thought it wasn't serious.
Oh, I shouldn't have touched that computer.
Well, here, Richard, we can do it this way. There you are.
All right, you're up. Okay. Okay. Okay, so that's the main title. The alternate title of this talk is Alfred Russel Wallace and the Statue of Limitations. And I will explain what I mean by that. The year was 1876. And Darwin was greatly in the ascendant. That's a picture my friend Pete Banshali made of Alfred Russel Wallace in the jungles of Malaysia, going after the famous flying frog that he found, the birds of paradise, the orangs. We'll get to that. I sent this slideshow to your department on a Dropbox, and it seems to have scrambled 1876 a little bit in the computer. Didn't mean to do that. Okay. 1876. Never before had the turn of a century been so poised for a revolution in thought. Science was being crowned as the new king of knowledge. Centuries-old beliefs were collapsing with bewildering rapidity. Yet, the 1870s, 80s, and 90s also saw a bold resurgence of belief in spirits, afterlife, and seances, the possibility of communicating with the dead. The dramatic conflict between science and spiritualism was played out in a bizarre London courtroom trial in 1876 when a famous American psychic, Dr. Henry Slade, was charged with bilking a gullible public with fraudulent seances. At Slade's trial, which has been left out of most of the history books, so I tracked it down, the two greatest naturalists of the 19th century, Alfred Russel Wallace and Charles Darwin, took opposing sides when the supernatural went on trial. It was an exciting time. All the sciences were piling up discoveries, but the overarching presence was that of Charles Darwin and evolution. He was almost deified. Here's a picture now. I'm going to show you a picture rarely seen over here. This is a 1920s Darwin statue in the can you see all right? In the Darwin Museum in Moscow. You see how he's depicted as a great thinker, as a hero of socialist realism, practically a secular god. Many statues of him have been created over the world, one after the other. He was honored with, he was a Socrates-like Darwin, a brooding Darwin, even a giant sand sculpture of Darwin in front of London's Natural History Museum. But his junior partner, Alfred Russel Wallace, with all these Darwin statues. Oh, here's Shrewsbury, another statue, and the last one I'm showing you is in the Natural History Museum in Kensington in London. And here's a composite. Now, you'll see that his co-discoverer of a theory of evolution, Alfred Russel Wallace, there he is, never got a statue. There's the empty plinth awaiting his statue. In fact, he could barely find enough teaching and lecture work to support his family. This brilliant naturalist, social thinker, polymath, and biogeographer was honored during the final decades of his life. He died in 1913. A little more than 100 years ago. It's still the centenary. He received awards and dinners, but never got a statue. There he is, skinning birds of paradise in New Guinea. He collected thousands of specimens, both for science and for collectors. At the time, there was a craze for natural history. People collected all kinds of stuffed animals, insects, butterflies. Is this working? Yeah, still no statue. Now there is Ernest Haeckel, great German evolutionist. When he lectured on evolution, he decorated theaters with a Gothic display of skeletons and embryos and stuffed apes. Tremendous showman, which some of you who want to spread the knowledge that you gain in science or in your specialties could take heed from. Some of the greatest people, like the people at the Museum of Natural History, Henry Fairfield Osborn, they were not only scientists, they were also artists, and they were also showmen. And sometimes that is what it takes to get the message across. And here is a picture of Haeckel by a contemporary cartoonist offering a halo up to Darwin at his death in 1882 as Darwin ascends into the clouds clutching his beloved apes. Now, some statues, we're getting into the statues in the memorial, some of his opponents didn't fare well, especially the anti-evolutionist Professor Louis Agassiz of Harvard. He was the foremost zoologist in the country. And he taught a kind of creationism to his zoology students. During a 1906 earthquake in Stanford University in California, his statue fell headfirst off the zoology building And the president of the college, David Starr Jordan, remarked, "I really much preferred Agassi in the abstract than in the concrete." Now, oh, you're a good crowd, I like it. You're getting all my jokes. Now, the iconic view of Darwin has lately eroded a bit. Here he is in an anxiety straitjacket some students put on him in Shrewsbury. And there's the same statue that had a traffic cone put on his head by a bunch of rowdy students. I don't know whether they were thinking he was a dunce or a wizard with this traffic cone. Take a choice. In the New York subway, somebody sent me a picture of Darwin's exhibit at the Museum of Natural History next to a poster for the movie Curious George, the monkey. Well, there's our man. Now, I happened to find this picture in an obscure archive. It had not been seen in 100 years, and I saw it and published it in Scientific American in 1996. And now this picture is everywhere. You've probably seen it. This is the iconic Darwin picture now. It was the last photo taken of him, and he used it on his visiting card. But for some reason, this picture disappeared for 100 years till I found it. Well, let's quickly go through Darwin, really quickly. Here he is with his beetles. You know, he was fascinated with beetles when he was a young man, and so was Wallace. They were the original Beatlemania guys in England. And he sailed on the Beagle all over the world, HMS Beagle, wonderful painting by John Collier. And when he went to the rainforest, he wrote in his diary that he was so enraptured by what he saw going on in the forest that, I love this quote, he said, "The mind is a chaos of delight." And could you hand me that water? Sorry. Thank you. Darwin and Wallace shared a kind of rapture of the natural world. And Sir David Attenborough is their intellectual descendant. Any Attenborough fans here? We love David Attenborough. He spoke at my Wallace convention in New York last year, and what a wonderful thing that was. At the age of 87, he has an undiminished astonishment and admiration for the natural world, and like Darwin and Wallace, a passion and a gift for sharing it with the rest of us. I think I threw in a picture of him, did I? Yeah. Sir David. Now there's Captain Fitzroy, and of the Beagle. There's a line from one of my songs: "Savage squaws in gowns and bonnets, spear-toting natives quoting sonnets." That is what Fitzroy wanted to do. He wanted to civilize these people and make them into little Englishmen, so that when sailors were shipwrecked off the coast of South America, which they often were, they would be rescued by the Indians, who would address them in English and serve them some tea and shepherd's pie, perhaps. Of course, it didn't work out that way. One of the Indians, known as Jemmy Button, threw off his clothes when he got back home, threw off his civilization, and took a wife. Darwin went back to his island too, to his own home in the English countryside, and he settled down to long married life. His new wife was his cousin, Emma Wedgwood, an heiress to the Wedgwood china fortune. Now, the Wedgwoods were famous for two things: their piety and their crockery. And in the case of her brother, Hensley, who believed he could speak with departed spirits, their crackpottery as well. So Darwin spent 8 years in his house studying barnacles. After 8, that's how he established his reputation in science. Before he could theorize, he had to systematize one group, and the barnacles were in disarray, and he put them made the taxonomy of barnacles. After 8 years, Darwin muttered, if you can mutter in a letter, "No man ever hated a barnacle as much as I did, not even a sailor on a slow-moving ship." And this is the study in which he wrote his books. And you can go there, you know, by the way. It's a museum now. Anybody can go to Darwin's home. It's wonderful. It's been preserved. Very inspiring. Walk his path behind the house where he thought his thoughts. So one day, in Down House, he gets a letter from young Alfred Russel Wallace, a young man 14 years his junior, working alone in the forests of Malaysia, had a malarial fit in his hammock and came up with exactly the same idea of evolution by natural selection. What does he do with it? Wrote it down and sent it to Darwin. Not knowing Darwin was been working on the same problem for the previous 20 years. And Darwin in turn got involved with his friends Joseph Hooker, the botanist, and Charles Lyell, the geologist. They were never all in the same room like that with the letter. That's an artist's rendering. But he said, "I never saw a more striking coincidence in all my life." He later said, it hit him like a thunderbolt out of a clear blue sky. There's old Wallace. This is a wonderful picture that was given to me by a great-grandson of Darwin, Quentin Keynes. And it was inscribed, "From the grandson of Wallace to the great-grandson of Darwin." Now this picture's everywhere too, I guess. And I met the man, Richard Wallace, a retired mathematics professor. I had one opportunity at a Darwin meeting in Germany to talk to him for 2 minutes, and I said, "Listen, may I have the audacity to ask you a question that I've always wanted to ask a descendant of Wallace?" And he said, "Sure, what is it?" I said, "Does the Wallace family hold any bad feelings, any animosity towards the Darwin family for their patriarch, Wallace, having been overshadowed so completely by Charles Darwin?" And the man, Wallace, looked at me with his clear blue eyes and his gray beard. Looked like Wallace himself, very similar. Wallace had this very penetrating, honest, open face. And the man said to me, "Grandfather didn't mind. Why should we?" Well, you know the story of their butterfly collecting. That's his friend Henry Walter Bates, who shot a curl-crested toucan and was mobbed by the rest of them. And so on in the Malay Archipelago. This is the wonderful book. Now you've all, if you really have any interest in natural history and the history of natural history, you must read this book. The Malay Archipelago, 1869. Wonderful book. Has been continuously in print, as has The Origin of Species, for more than 100 years. And it's a delightful read, even today. It doesn't have that sort of convoluted Victorian prose that Darwin loved so much. In my opinion, my humble opinion, Wallace was a better writer, no question. Okay, now let's get to spiritualism. Now, there's an illustration from a contemporary book on spiritualism done with a double exposure, which was the CGI, the special effects of its day, a ghostly apparition appearing. And to give you an idea of how close science and spiritualism were at the time, they were so intertwined. Of course, they're completely separate now, but this is an article from the New York Times, Sunday, New York Times, in 1913. "Life after death declared proved by evolution." That's the headline. And there's a series of skulls, including, by the way, the discredited Piltdown skull. And the subhead, "Prominent scientist holds that man's ascent from apes means an incessant evolutionary process for humanity, not stopped by the grave, and proves the existence of a supreme being." So there you have an anthropology professor from Columbia looking at a collection of skulls and deciding it proves the existence of a supreme being. You know, you see what you want to see, don't you? Now we get to my favorite guy, zoologist, Thomas Henry Huxley, known as Darwin's bulldog. Rare picture of him with a beard drawing a gorilla skull on the board. Huxley showed that in a book called The Man's Place in Nature, he took on the anatomy, comparative anatomy, and showed that humans and apes were much more similar to each other than either were to monkeys. Now, Huxley hated, there's Huxley's famous illustration. Now, Huxley hated spiritualists as frauds, as shams. Now, this was a contemporary cartoon of a spirit-rapping seance, and it's called What Foxes Will Say, Geese and Asses Will Believe. And that was a popular saying at the time, and here it is illustrated. In fact, the poet Browning wrote a famous poem called Sludge the Medium, in which he took to task, was based on the character that I started to tell you about in the beginning, Henry Slade, the target of that trial in London. Now, this was the first time that a scientist ever sued a psychic for conducting fraudulent experiments and had him dragged into Bow Street Court as a fraud and an imposter. Nowadays, we don't criminalize psychics anymore. We give them their own television shows and buy their books, make them rich. Of course, the whole monkey thing is raging at the time. I dragged them into court, okay. The whole monkey thing is raging. Are we from monkeys? Are we from apes? Well, the pivotal scene took place at Oxford University in 1860, the debate between Thomas Henry Huxley and Bishop Wilberforce, Samuel Wilberforce. Huxley was a young rebel at the time, trying to insert evolution into everything, and finally the bishop said, perhaps Professor Huxley would care to tell us, is he descended from an ape on the side of his grandfather or his grandmother? What an insult to Victorian womanhood. Huxley jumped up and he said, and by the way, there are several versions of what he said, but apparently it was something like this. Ladies and gentlemen, my Lord Bishop, when we speak of descent in biology, we speak in terms of hundreds, perhaps thousands of years. It would never have occurred to me to speak about my own immediate familial ancestry in a serious gathering of this kind. But if the question is put to me, would I rather have for an ancestor a venerable grinning ape or a man of great intellect, a man of great power, a man of great prestige, a man of great privilege, who uses that power and that privilege and that influence for the mere purpose of making a mockery of a serious scientific discussion? Why then I unhesitatingly affirm my preference for the ape. Still a good line 150 years later, isn't it? Well, a lady fainted, by the way. You didn't talk to bishops that way. Darwin even said, "How durst thou talk to a living bishop in such a fashion?" Funny thing is that later on, they became so famous for this that Huxley and Wilberforce repeated the debate around different venues. Everybody wanted to hear it. It was like, I don't know, you're not old enough for this, but it's like what Gordon Liddy and Timothy Leary used to do. After their big fight, they then became on the road with a dog and pony show, doing their debate about, I guess, there we are. All right, now, one day, the bishop died. How did he die? He was riding a horse on a friend's estate over a very rocky field, and the horse threw him. The bishop fell down and split his head open on a rock. And Huxley wrote, "Dear Darwin, I see our friend the bishop has met an end all too fitting for his life. His brains have finally made contact with hard reality." And the result was fatal. Now let me tell you the story of the Slade trial. What happened? An American psychic came to London, a spirit medium, Henry Slade. He gave seances for a Guinea seance. He caused quite a stir. Everybody was trying to get Darwin to go to one of the seances. He refused. He said, "I'm a terrible bigot on the subject. I don't believe in it." So he sent Huxley, young Huxley. He issued an order. Go there under a pseudonym and find out what you can. And Huxley went and came back and said, "It's just all a bunch of nonsense, trickery, you could see right through it." And Darwin said, "Well, just as I thought." Meanwhile, a student of Huxley's named Ray Lankester, wanting to impress Darwin and Huxley, his teachers, attended a seance. Now what the guy did was he would hold a slate under a table, and it would come up with written things on it in chalk, answers to your questions from his dead wife. You asked a question, his dead wife would answer it on the slate. And Lancaster snatched the slate away and said, "I haven't asked the question yet, and the slate is full of writing. You are a fraud and an imposter." And he took him to court and prosecuted him as a fraud. Now the key to the whole story is this. It took me a long time to find it. I mean, why should we care about this? But I found it. Darwin secretly sent 10 pounds, some good money in those days, to Lancaster, because you had to pay to prosecute somebody. The state wouldn't do it. And he said, quote, "I would like to contribute to the cost of the prosecution as I consider this a public benefit." Now, who was the star witness for the defense of Henry Slade? Oh, I was so happy to find out who it was. It was Alfred Russel Wallace. Now, Wallace thought that this man Slade was just about as honest and as full of integrity as anybody in the field of natural science. That's what he said at the trial. And magicians got up. Maskelyne, the famous magician at the time, got up and did some slate tricks. And then he did some ghost tricks. The audience was wowed. And the judge said, "Enough of this. This doesn't prove anything. It just proves that you can make something look like this. It doesn't prove that that's the way Slade did it." Now, I read all the transcripts in the London Times. It was the big deal of the day. Slade was convicted under an old law against fortune tellers, but he never served a day in jail. A sharp lawyer got the verdict set aside on a loophole, and Slade fled to Europe, where he enjoyed great success, first in France, then in Russia, but he kept getting caught and exposed so many times that eventually he died disgraced and in poverty in a cheap rooming house in New York. I published the story of the Slade trial in 1996. There's the slates again, in Scientific American. And by the way, I have in my article a picture of the slates. I hope you forgive me. I'm going to sit because my feet are complaining. But yeah, just turn it around. And I hope you can still see me and hear me. But no, don't worry, Patty. Patty. All right. Okay. All right.
And everybody can still see that.
Good. Cut this out of the tape. Just cut to me, cut to my face here, sitting. Okay? We're all set? Where are we? The slates with the chalk. I have in my article a picture of the slates with the chalk writing still on it. I had it photographed when I found it in the Cambridge Library. They had it in an uncatalogued collection when I was researching Arthur Conan Doyle, by the way, who was an ardent spiritualist, and here was the slate. They said, "Richard, we don't know what this is. Do you?" I said, "Boy, do I ever." This is the slate of Henry Slade. And it had a letter inserted into the slates. That's the article. It's online now, I think, without the illustration. But anyway, letter inserted into it. Sorry, there it is, with the letter. And the letter was by Hensley Wedgwood, Darwin's brother-in-law. And he said in the letter, "I have watched this, the slate writing, a demonstration, and I assure you there was no trickery involved. I could detect no trickery." Hensley. Hensley wanted to be a great scientist too. Hensley thought that Darwin and Sir Francis Galton, their cousin, and all the Darwin family were so brilliant, and he wanted to be part of that. And he kept telling Darwin, "There's a whole world out there, a new world to discover." And Darwin said, "Yeah, fine." And that was that. There's an interesting postscript about Hensley Wedgwood. In 1880, I found that he sent Darwin a long handwritten manuscript, a spiritualist synthesis of science and religion. Would Darwin read it and perhaps suggest where it might be published? In a melancholy mood, Darwin sat down. Oh, there's Hensley. In a melancholy mood, Darwin sat down in his study and replied. He may have remembered the times that Wedgwood had gone to bat for him many years before, many times. He had helped persuade Darwin's father to let him go on the voyage of the Beagle. It was to his cousin Hensley that Darwin had once entrusted publication of The Origin of Species in case he were to die. Darwin wrote, "My dear cousin, it is indeed a long time since we met, and I suppose if we now did so, we should not know one another. But your former image is perfectly clear to me." However, he refused even to read Hensley's paper. Right? I don't know if anybody's ever read it. It's in the archive. It goes on forever. Writing, I couldn't get through it. Writing, "There have been too many such attempts," said Darwin, "to reconcile Genesis and science." The two cousins, who had once been so close, were now hopelessly estranged over the question of science and the supernatural. That same year, Lancaster, now a professor of zoology, declined requests to continue ghost busting. "The spirit medium," he wrote in an 1880 letter to the Pall Mall Gazette, "is a curious and unsavory specimen of natural history. If you wish to study him, you must take him unawares. I have done my share of the skunk hunting. Let others follow." He was later appointed director of the British Museum of Natural History. Ironically, in 1912, there he is over there, famous painting. In 1912, this is the Piltdown Group, Lancaster, the nemesis of fakers, was completely fooled by the Piltdown Man hoax. There's the Piltdown pub that used to exist in England. One of the most notorious frauds in the history of evolutionary biology. For the next 40 years, scientists accepted the ape-man fragments dug up about 25 miles from Darwin's home as the first ancestor of man. Use your common sense. How likely is it that the first ancestor of man would be found 25 miles from Darwin's home? Never occurred to them that that was a bit strange. And they uncritically embraced the fossil forgery. It took them 40 years to come out of that. Britain so desperately wanted to have the first man. France had Neanderthals. Germany had Neanderthals. The English ancestor, there wasn't any. Huxley, who died in 1895, knew full well that more than a few scientists were prone to develop their own irrationally held beliefs. While young, he had battled churchmen to establish the scientific approach to unraveling human origins. He said, no ghosts, gods, or goblins, or spirits, please, in our theories. In The Descent of Man, by the way, he was so famous during his day, they named a brand of cigars after him. Isn't that something? I love that. Somebody sent me that. It just knocked me out. So in The Descent of Man, 1871, I think, this is a wonderful quote. Darwin himself had urged a skeptical approach to unconfirmed observations. He believed that accepting flimsy evidence is much more dangerous than adopting incorrect theories. Quote from Darwin, "False facts are highly injurious to the progress of science, for they often long endure. But false views, if supported by some evidence, do little harm, as everyone takes a salutary pleasure in proving their falseness. Better to have a false theory than a false piece of evidence. That will throw you off the rails." Now, the whole spiritualist thing in modern times was invented by a couple of girls called the Fox sisters, Margaret and Kate Fox, in Hydesville, New York. They conversed with spirits that were rapping on the floor and the walls. You'd go in their house and you'd hear all kinds of knocks and raps, and they'd say, "Oh, the spirits are here." Darwin would never think of doing such a thing as trying to mimic the tricks of the trade. But Huxley loved to beat them at their own game. He mastered the art of loudly snapping his toes inside his boots. And he would say, "I think the spirits are coming." Now listen to the kind of detail I found that the great scientist gives you on toe snapping. Quote, Huxley, "By dint of patience, perseverance, and practice, the toe snaps may be repeated very rapidly and rendered forte or piano at pleasure. To produce the best effect," says our great scientist, "it is advisable to have thin socks and a roomy, hard-soled boot. Moreover, it is well to pick out a thin place in the carpet so as to profit by the resonance of the floor." The solution to the mysterious ghost rappings and glowing images of dead relatives hovering in darkened rooms is now no longer baffling to us. Over the years, professional illusionists like Harry Houdini, Amazing Randy, is Houdini supposedly headlines in the Cleveland Press. Houdini traps spirit medium. The Amazing Randy, some of you may know, and of course my wonderful friend, maybe that's an overstatement, but he comes to my shows, Penn and Teller, have taken delight in showing us how the ghostly phenomena was staged. But a much larger mystery in our story remains unresolved: the enigmatic mind of Alfred Russel Wallace. Even in his own day, he drove his friends and admirers mad, trying to understand how he could reconcile his scientific brilliance with his mysticism. It sometimes seemed, even to his contemporaries, that there were two Wallaces: the Wallace of natural selection, biogeography, covered 14,000 miles in the Malay Archipelago, discovered thousands of new species, 125,000 specimens, and of course Wallace's line. Some of you may know. You know Wallace's line? Anybody? Yes? It's a faunal distinction between the Asian-derived fauna and the Australian-derived fauna that cuts across a couple of islands in Malaysia. Well, in spite of all this great science, Wallace thought that the human mind could not possibly have been produced by natural selection acting alone, but required a boost from what he called the unseen universe of spirit. Books are still being written about how to reconcile the two Wallaces. The author G.K. Chesterton, on Wallace's 81st birthday in 1904, proclaimed him one of the most interesting men of the 19th century because, quote, he was both the founder of a revolution, naturalistic, materialistic evolution, and a counter-revolution, spiritualistic, theistic evolution. Chesterton chose as the other most interesting person of the 19th century the poet Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman, who also had no problem living with contradictions, in his poem Song of Myself, Whitman admitted, "Do I contradict myself? Oh, well, then I contradict myself very well. I am large. I contain multitudes." Wallace could apply himself brilliantly to see how far scientific method would take him, and it enabled him to unravel puzzles and mysteries that had baffled naturalists for centuries. When Darwin was puzzled about insect mimicry or peacock's tails, he turned to Wallace and always got a very ingenious answer. "You are the right man to appeal to in a difficulty," Darwin told him. So the question remains, how did a man of such brilliance allow himself to be so completely fooled by tricksters, by con men, by scam artists? And I think I have a clue about the answer. The first part is Wallace's extreme honesty and transparency. He thought that they were honest. He was incapable of looking someone in the eye and lying to them. It was not difficult for some of these medium characters to do exactly that. They'd look you in the eye and they'd lie to you. That was something that was beyond Wallace's comprehension. Naive and trusting, he refused to think the worst of people who spoke as if they were earnest seekers after truth. Wallace was a keen observer, Huxley noted. He could sit in a jungle and observe and record everything that was going on. He trusted his senses and his reason because there was nothing there to deliberately trick him. There was no misdirection, the greatest tool of the magician, the illusionist, the con man, the swindler, to purposely swerve your attention from what you're observing and distract it to something else. That is a basic principle of tricksters that Wallace never figured on when he was dealing with so-called mediums and psychics. The most profound reason that Wallace was so easily taken in by spiritualistic imposters, of course, was that he held a sincere, deep-seated belief in the world of spirit. He had concluded that Earth is a place where human souls are schooled, improved, and perfected for their next higher life. Very Eastern kind of idea. If mediums and channelers were occasionally caught in trickery and fraud, he argued, that does not disprove the reality of spirit. Similarly, he said, the existence of some counterfeit money only shows that plenty of real money must exist somewhere. Somehow. As old age approached Wallace, he still could not find a way of making money. Teaching jobs were few and far between, and he ended up grading examination papers for students in science classes, a very laborious way for a man of his age and accomplishment to make a living. And Darwin thought it was a shame and decided to apply for a government pension for Wallace for his lifelong service to natural history. So Darwin went around to scientific friends putting names on a petition, and a note came to him from his friend, the great botanist Joseph Hooker of Kew Gardens, who said, "Charles, I can hardly see how I can apply to one's friends in government for a pension for Wallace when he has been a public and leading spiritualist. Darwin wrote to Huxley, what do I say to that? Huxley replied, just tell him that Wallace's beliefs about an afterlife are his own personal business, and besides, they are no worse than the superstitions of the majority of the country. So Darwin wrote that back to Hooker. And Wallace did get his pension, but he still didn't get any statues. He was not buried in Westminster Abbey, as Darwin was, although he did get a little plaque near Darwin's tomb there. But he wanted to be buried out in the countryside in Dorset in a grave in a little rural cemetery without any fuss. And he was. But it had a most peculiar gravestone on it. It was a huge log of petrified wood jutting straight up into the air. Whose idea was that is not known. But you can draw your own conclusions. It's still there after 100 years. Wallace's only monument in stone. But I'm happy to tell you that Wallace, in this centenary year, finally did get his statue. During the Wallace Centenary celebration at the Natural History Museum in London on November 7, 2013, exactly 100 years after Wallace's death at the age of 93, the great naturalist filmmaker Sir David Attenborough unveils a new and wonderful statue. Rather than adopting a heroic pose, sculptor Anthony Smith chose to depict him as a working field biologist and collector in the Malaysian rainforest, intent on netting the long-sought golden birdwing butterfly. That huge, rare butterfly, Wallace's discovery, gave him such a thrill when he caught it that he nearly fainted with excitement, he wrote in his diary. His heart was beating and he just, oh man, that did it. In addition, a long-neglected oil portrait of Wallace was hung near Darwin's. Oh, there's the wonderful statue. Looking, they've got actually the butterfly on the building that he's facing, as if he's about to swing on it. In addition, they found a long-neglected oil portrait of Wallace, which was hung near Darwin's statue on the staircase at the entrance to the Natural History Museum. Looking back to 1882, we see in an old print the way that staircase looked when Darwin's 2-ton marble statue was placed there to replace that of Richard Owen, the museum's founder. Now, Darwin ruled that staircase for many years with some absences and returns, and now he is back, and Wallace is back. And here we see Wallace scholars and assorted dignitaries and affiliated intelligentsia ascend the staircase to unveil the portrait of Wallace. If you're sharp-eyed, you might see somebody resembling me over there. At the same time, his memory was being celebrated in New York, Singapore, and Wales, and thousands of his letters and writings were being preserved and placed online to make his life and thought accessible to future generations. Now, Darwin became melancholy in his last days, although he never regretted having devoted his life to science and accepting the finality of death. Wallace, on the other hand, was cheerful and optimistic to the last and looked forward to new vistas of adventure and discovery in the spirit world. Both of them, Darwin and Wallace, have helped us on the path to discovering who we are. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, of my alma mater, UCLA. Thanks to John Templeton Foundation, and good night, Alfred Russel Wallace, wherever you are. Thank you.
We have
Thank you.
some time for questions if you'll entertain them.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll entertain questions. Keep them entertaining. The questions.
I have one kind of a crazy one. Do you know the picture of Darwin where he's doing this, and is that real or not?
No, that's a Photoshop job.
Yeah, that's what I thought.
Yeah,
Thank you.
yeah.
Picture of Darwin saying, "Be quiet."
He's saying, it looks like he's saying.
You know, he's got his finger on the side of his nose like Saint Nick or something. Yeah. Yes, sir.
So during the trial, was Wallace sort of cross-examined? And
Yeah, I told you. He said this man is he's full of integrity. He wouldn't lie. He's a sincere seeker after truth in natural science. I've attended his seances, and using his reputation as a great observer. You know, he said, I've detected no trickery, no fraud. But as I said, Huxley said, that Wallace was a great observer when nobody was trying to trick him. He was a great observer in the field. He was a great observer of animals and plants. But they didn't go out of their way to defraud him, you know. Yes.
So why do you think that everyone always talks about the sort of middle late 1800s as a time when science was getting a lot of traction and people were very attracted to science and scientific thinking? Why was the popularity with seances and sort of anti-science, if you will, anti-science, also so popular? There's Doyle, there's Wallace, and some very big minds attracted to it. Why was it so popular?
The question is, why was spiritualism and the belief in spirits and ghosts and afterlife so popular despite the rise of science in the 19th century? I might well ask the same question about today. Why do we have so many people denying science, so many people going to fundamentalist religion if the figures are are accurate? And I want to say more about that in a second. But my answer to the question is, people had been comforting themselves for so long with the idea of an afterlife, and that good behavior would be rewarded, and their sufferings and their privations would come to an end, and they would be raised up with the holy hosts of angels. Very hard to give up. And what these guys did is they provided a back door in science. They said, well, it's not religion, it's actually science, and we can prove it. And we can conduct experiments, and we can convince you, not by reading the Bible, but we'll show you right in this room, we'll show you a spirit. And so I think the common idea that historians use about it is that it was the secularization of religion. It was bringing religion in the back door. People want that comfort, particularly, and some scientists, of course, for many years maintained both, like Wallace did, maintained both, and saw no contradiction. I saw a video on YouTube the other day that I really got a kick out of. A fundamentalist preacher from Georgia went to the Scandinavian countries, the root of real American culture, right? And went around asking Swedes and the Danes and Finns in the street, you believe in God? No. Why should I believe in somebody that doesn't exist? These were the answers. And this preacher from Georgia, his mind was blown. He found one person on the street that said, yes, I believe in God. He said, great, are you a Christian? He said, no, I'm a Muslim. I finally found one person who believed in God. He went to the church and he spoke to the pastors, and they perform same-sex marriages in their church. And it was actually decreed by the parliament that they must do that. They must not discriminate against same-sex marriages. And he said, well, don't you resent the government telling you that? They said, no, we think it's a good idea, because in our idea of God, which is not a person, we think God is love. We think, that sex is given for love. It's not necessarily just to procreate the human race. It's to bring people together. And this, you could just see his mind explode on camera, his head explode. I recommend it.
If somebody has to go, please go. I think Richard will take some questions, and I do have one that goes to this issue of holding inconsistencies in mind. And
yeah, let's wait, Patty. Let's wait for people who have to go. Thank you for coming. I know you have to go places. Thank you. Thank you. And we'll take a few more questions for those that want to stay a few minutes. Not long. We're not going to stay long. But Patty, we will certainly honor Patty's question. What is it, darling?
So my question is related. It's a little complex, but it's related to these inconsistencies in the minds of great men or women who are scholars, and we confront that. But it's also related to the fact that here we are 100 years after Wallace is dead, and here we are all over the world celebrating the life of this man. And I've wondered about our own...
Maybe he's dead. Yeah, go ahead.
Maybe he's dead.
Right.
Exactly. I wondered about our own motivation for this. Is this
Motivation for what?
for all of this celebration? And one of the things that I thought, and I wanted to ask you about it, because you have motivation for why you did this. Templeton has motivation for why they funded it. And I'm very interested in the motivation for the students who came to the Wallace course. Why did they do it? I'm curious about my own passion about the scientific work of Alfred Russel Wallace. Why now? What is it about this particular time that has sparked this? So the cynical view is that evolutionists take any opportunity to speak about evolution to large groups of people. So we're just being opportunistic. That's one thought. But what is it? Templeton is well known for being religiously interested in religion. And you have the great Templeton grant. Some people have objected to the fact that our Wallace celebration is funded by Templeton. Excuse me, they're upset with that, but they are.
This is known as political correctness.
Why are we celebrating Wallace?
I was turned down by 5 major institutions, nonprofit, to handle the grant because they thought Templeton money was tainted, and they thought there was a secret religious agenda or a intelligent design thing that was going to be inserted, and I had to reassure them over and over again that I would take absolutely no control or agendas on anything, that was not going to happen. And despite the fact that I assured the London Museum, the American Museum, the Linnean Society, one woman absolutely put her foot down. I'm going to tell a story out of school. A woman very powerful in British science called David Attenborough and said, "You're not thinking of going to New York for Richard Milner, are you, and doing a Wallace lecture?" She said, "That would be a very bad thing to do and take Wallace money, Templeton money." And Sir David said to a friend of mine, that does it, I'm going. I don't allow anybody to tell me who to speak, where to speak, how to speak, whose money to take. And the fact that she did that, I owe her really a thank you note. But the question, yes, there is resistance to honoring Wallace, and it's part of, I think, a very unfortunate dogmatic tendency that we have in modern society, that everybody has to think alike, and the fundamentalist Christians feel that way, and unfortunately many scientists feel that way. And you know, Huxley said, when scientists adopt a dogma, it commits suicide. When science becomes dogma, it commits suicide. The open discussion of, see, what Templeton is interested in, what they call the big questions. Who are we? How did we get here? Did we have help from somewhere in getting here or not? Or is it a mechanistic universe, or is there spirit in the universe? I don't see anything wrong with asking those questions and discussing them, and particularly by intelligent people, not people bound by dogma on either side. I myself personally find great inspiration from the attitude of Wallace, Darwin, and Attenborough. I wrote an article on it long ago. I called it, not long ago, I called it Three Birds of a Feather, because they were so passionate about, in case of Wallace and Attenborough, birds of paradise. How did these birds, 38, 39 species of birds, living in a dark and gloomy, inaccessible rainforest, develop such bizarre courtship rituals, such bizarre colors, such bizarre territorial rituals? If you're not amazed and confounded and astounded, then there's something dead in you. This doesn't mean you believe in God. This means that you're in the face of an enormous mystery, the best we can do, and there are people in this room who have spent their lives trying to unravel the way this stuff works. I'm sure that if they are sincere in their quest, there comes a time when they look around at the natural world and say, God damn, how in the hell did this come about? Yeah, we have a theory of evolution, and maybe we don't want to go back to the biblical God and souls and all of that sort of thing. But let's try to stay open to the idea that we really don't know it all. That's my last word.
Richard's going to be around all day, and so...
Well, we're having lunch with some students now or
yeah,
something?
well,
Yeah, good.
having lunch with students.
All right. Thank you all for coming. You've been a lovely audience. I'd like to take you home with me.
Great, Richard.